The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, turning the small suburban street into a dull, gray reflection of everything Ethan felt inside. He stood by the doorway, suitcase in hand, his mind a storm louder than the one outside. Behind him, the faint hum of a kettle boiled over in the kitchen, where Lena, the woman who had once been his entire reason to wake up, stood frozen, pretending to tidy up dishes that were already clean. They both knew this was the end. Words had been said, silence had done worse. Love had slowly drained from the spaces between them, replaced by exhaustion, disappointment, and the sharp ache of things left unsaid. Ethan had once promised her the world, but over time, all he'd given her was his absence, emotionally first, then physically. His work had consumed him, his pride had blinded him, and now, standing there with that suitcase, he felt the weight of every mistake pressing down on his chest like a stone. He turned slightly, expecting another argument, maybe one last plea, but Lena didn't speak. Her eyes were red, her lips trembling, but she stayed quiet. She'd already fought for him too many times. She'd begged for their family long before he'd realized what he was throwing away. And so, she let him go quietly, because sometimes silence hurts more than screaming ever could. Ethan gripped the handle tighter, his breath catching. There was a time he couldn't stand to see her cry, now, he felt numb. It wasn't that he didn't love her anymore, he did, but love, he thought, wasn't enough when life keeps breaking you down. He turned toward the door, took one final look at the home they'd built, the same walls that once echoed with laughter and now only held echoes of regret. He stepped outside, and the cold rain hit him like reality itself. He didn't notice the small pair of eyes watching from the hallway. Daniel, their 6-year-old son, had been standing there the whole time, clutching a stuffed bear that had seen better days. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew one thing: when Dad took the suitcase, he never came back the same. Ethan walked toward the car, trying not to look back, because he knew if he did, he might lose the resolve to leave. But then he heard it, the sound of tiny feet running behind him, the front door swinging open, and a voice so small yet so piercing it cut through the storm. "Please don't leave my mom." Daniel's voice cracked, trembling with innocence and fear. Ethan froze mid-step. The words hung in the air, heavier than thunder. He turned slowly, his heart pounding, and saw his son standing barefoot on the wet porch, rain dripping from his hair, tears streaming down his cheeks. Lena rushed out a moment later, her hands shaking as she pulled Daniel back inside, but it was too late, the damage was done. Ethan had seen the fear in his son's eyes, the kind that children shouldn't know. For a moment, the man who thought he'd lost all feeling suddenly felt everything at once. Shame, guilt, love, regret, it all came crashing down like the rain around him. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words just wouldn't come. He crouched down, leaving the suitcase in the mud, and opened his arms. Daniel hesitated, then ran into him, burying his face in Ethan's chest. The boy's small hands clung to his father's coat as if holding him there could stop time. Ethan held him tight, feeling his son's heartbeat racing against his own, and something inside him cracked open, that part of a man that realizes leaving isn't strength, it's escape. Lena stood at the doorway, torn between pain and hope. She'd seen Ethan leave before, she'd never seen him cry. But there he was, holding their son in the pouring rain, his shoulders shaking with a grief he could no longer hide. "Danny," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking, "I'm not leaving because I don't love you. But he couldn't finish the sentence. How do you explain to a child that love can exist even when life falls apart? How do you make them understand that sometimes grown-ups make decisions their hearts can't justify?" Daniel pulled back, his little face wet with tears and rain. "Then why do you look sad when you say goodbye?" The question hit Ethan like a knife. He looked up at Lena, the woman who had stood beside him through everything, and for the first time in years, he didn't see the arguments, the distance, or the bitterness. He saw the girl he'd once fallen in love with, standing there scared but strong, holding their son's stuffed bear in her trembling hands. He rose slowly, his hand still resting on Daniel's shoulder. The suitcase sat abandoned beside the steps, the rain soaking through it, and in that moment, it felt symbolic, everything he'd packed to run from, now nothing more than a muddy reminder of cowardice. "Go inside, buddy," Ethan said gently. "You'll get sick out here." But Daniel shook his head stubbornly, his voice small but firm. "Not until you say you'll come back." Ethan looked at him, at the raw purity in those eyes that hadn't yet learned how complicated life could be, and for the first time, he realized how much damage a broken promise could do. He had been so focused on escaping his own pain that he hadn't seen the way it echoed through the people he loved most. His son's plea wasn't just about wanting him to stay, it was a cry for security, for the sense of family Ethan had been dismantling piece by piece. He looked back at Lena, who stood there silently, her eyes glistening not from the rain but from a small flicker of hope she didn't dare express. The rain started to slow, tapering into a soft drizzle. Ethan finally took a step back toward the house, each footfall heavier than the last. Daniel's eyes lit up, and he instinctively reached for his father's hand. Ethan took it without thinking. The warmth of that tiny hand reminded him of all the nights he used to tuck Daniel in, of bedtime stories and laughter that once filled this home. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped showing up for those moments, always telling himself he'd make it up next week, not realizing that next week never came. When they stepped inside, the smell of home hit him, faint lavender, coffee, and something deeper, memory. Lena handed Daniel a towel and told him to go change, her voice soft but steady. Once he was gone, silence filled the room again. Ethan stood by the doorway, dripping water onto the floor, while Lena leaned against the counter, her arms folded, her face unreadable. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan finally said, "I didn't mean to hurt him." Lena nodded slightly. "I know," she replied, her voice tired but calm. "But meaning doesn't stop the hurt, Ethan. Actions do." He wanted to argue, to explain himself, but she was right. He'd spent years convincing himself that distance was better than disappointment, that leaving would somehow protect them from his own failures. But in reality, it had only made them collateral damage in his own self-doubt. He sighed deeply, rubbing his forehead. "I thought walking away was the only way to fix things," he muttered. Lena looked at him, her eyes softening just enough to let the truth slip in. "Sometimes fixing things means staying even when it's hard." The words echoed in his mind, painfully simple yet impossible to ignore. He'd once been a man who fought for everything, his career, his pride, his dreams. But he hadn't fought for the one thing that mattered most, them. As he stood there, drenched and ashamed, he realized this wasn't the end of something, it was a chance, maybe the last one, to begin again. Daniel came running back in, now wearing dry clothes, clutching his bear again. He smiled shyly, then hugged both of them, as if trying to glue the cracks between his parents with his tiny arms. Ethan felt a tear roll down his cheek, not from sadness, but from clarity. The sentence, "Please don't leave my mom," had stripped away everything that didn't matter and forced him to see what did. In that moment, he didn't know how to fix their broken marriage, but he knew he wasn't going to run from it anymore. He was going to stay, not because it was easy, but because his family deserved a man who didn't quit when it got hard. As night fell, the storm finally cleared. Ethan sat by Daniel's bedside later, watching him sleep, listening to the gentle rhythm of his breathing. He remembered the last time he'd sat there, years ago, when Daniel was just a baby. Time had slipped through his fingers, but maybe it wasn't too late to start holding on again. He glanced at Lena, who stood quietly in the doorway, her eyes soft, the faintest trace of a smile playing on her lips. For the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel lost. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, purpose. Outside, the world smelled like rain and renewal. Inside, something fragile but real was beginning to heal. Ethan didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't walking away anymore. Morning light crept through the blinds, soft and uncertain, like the fragile calm after a storm. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock, a sound Ethan had never noticed before, though it had always been there, marking the seconds he used to rush past. He sat at the kitchen table, coffee gone cold in front of him, staring at the spot where Lena used to sit every morning with Daniel, laughing over burnt toast and spilled juice. Now, she moved around the kitchen with measured silence, not angry, just guarded, as if afraid any wrong word might shatter the temporary peace between them. Daniel was still asleep upstairs, clutching the same stuffed bear he'd refused to let go of last night. Ethan's eyes were heavy, but his mind was wide awake. He kept hearing his son's voice echoing in his head, "Please don't leave my mom." That single sentence had stripped away every excuse, every justification he'd built to protect his ego. He'd almost walked away from everything real because he'd mistaken fear for wisdom. When Lena finally sat down across from him, her movements were careful. They hadn't really talked since last night, not beyond the necessary words about Daniel's bedtime. For a while, they just sat there, the sound of rainwater dripping from the roof filling the space between them. Then Ethan finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "I want to make things right," he said. Lena looked up, not angry, not forgiving, just tired. "Ethan, we've been here before," she replied. "You say that, you stay for a while, and then the first time things get hard, you shut down again." He nodded, accepting it. She was right. He'd always been the one to retreat when things got heavy. He thought leaving made him strong, that walking away was better than fighting a losing battle. But he was realizing now that love isn't about winning, it's about showing up, again and again, even when it hurts. "I don't have promises this time," he said quietly. "Just proof. If I can earn it." Lena stared at him for a long moment before speaking. "I don't know if I can believe that again, Ethan," she said. "Not just for me, for Daniel. He's old enough to remember now. You can't disappear again. Ethan's jaw tightened, shame stinging at the truth. I know, he said. And I'm not asking you to trust me today. I just want the chance to start over, as a better father, and if you'll let me, a better man. Something in his tone caught her off guard. There was no desperation in it, no defensiveness, just quiet conviction. For the first time in years, Lena saw the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who used to build forts out of couch cushions with Daniel, who used to dance with her in the kitchen even when there was no music. She looked down at her coffee, hiding the flicker of emotion in her eyes. We'll see, she whispered. Over the next few weeks, Ethan stayed. Not just physically, he showed up. He woke Daniel for school every morning, packed his lunches, and even helped with homework he barely understood. He found a part-time job close to home so he could be around more. It wasn't glamorous, nothing about rebuilding ever is, but each small action chipped away at the wall that had grown between him and his family. Lena watched quietly at first, skeptical but observant. She saw him fix the leaky faucet without being asked, take Daniel to the park on his lunch break, and tuck him in every night with a bedtime story. Slowly, her guarded silence began to soften. One evening, as Ethan sat on the couch helping Daniel draw superheroes, Lena leaned against the doorway, watching them. She saw the way Daniel laughed freely again, the way Ethan looked at his son as if trying to memorize every second. For the first time in years, she didn't see a broken man trying to prove himself, she saw a father who refused to quit. But healing isn't a straight line. Some nights, they still fought, not about betrayal or anger, but about pain that hadn't yet faded. Lena would remind him how much his absence had hurt. Ethan would listen, this time without defending himself. He'd learned that sometimes love means letting someone express their pain without needing to fix it. He apologized more than he ever had before, not just with words but with presence. And every time Daniel heard them argue, Ethan made sure he also saw them reconcile, to teach him that love isn't perfect, it's persistent. Months passed, and spring arrived. The garden behind the house, once wilted and neglected, began to bloom again under Lena's care. Ethan joined her one afternoon, kneeling in the dirt beside her. You remember when we planted those roses? He asked, smiling faintly. She laughed softly. You mean the ones that died because you forgot to water them? Yeah, he said, chuckling. Guess I'm trying to do better this time. She looked at him, eyes warm, but didn't answer. They worked quietly side by side, the way two people do when words aren't enough to describe the fragile peace between them. That night, after putting Daniel to bed, Ethan found himself standing in the doorway of their bedroom, not their separate rooms anymore, but the same one they'd once shared. Lena was reading, and for a long time, he just watched her. The woman who had once been a symbol of everything he'd lost was now proof of what he could still rebuild. Lena, he said softly. She looked up, expectant. Thank you for not giving up on me, he whispered. She closed the book and set it aside. I almost did, she admitted. But Daniel's words that night, they reminded me who you were before everything fell apart. She paused, her voice trembling just slightly. And I wanted to believe that man still existed. Ethan stepped closer, his hand finding hers. He does, he said. And this time, he's staying. Months later, the house felt alive again, laughter in the mornings, dinners together, the smell of pancakes on Sundays. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Daniel would still sometimes ask, Dad, you're not leaving again, right? And Ethan would kneel down, meet his eyes, and say, never again, buddy. Each time he said it, he meant it more deeply. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the three of them sat on the porch, the same place where everything had almost fallen apart. Daniel was drawing on the wooden railing, humming to himself. Lena leaned against Ethan's shoulder, quiet and content. He looked at them, his family, and realized that, please don't leave my mom, wasn't just a plea. It was a reminder that love is a responsibility, not just a feeling. That night, Ethan finally understood, walking away doesn't end pain, it just transfers it to the ones who love you most. He took a deep breath, smiled, and whispered, thank you, Danny, for saving me that night. Lena looked at him curiously, but he just smiled and kissed her forehead. The porch light flickered above them, the night calm and forgiving. If you've ever believed in second chances, never stop fighting for the people who matter. Because sometimes one sentence, one honest plea, can change an entire life. Ethan looked at the camera of his son's little recorder. Daniel had started filming them for a school project, and said with a grin, hey, if you're still watching this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Because every story deserves a new beginning. And with that, the screen faded to black, but the story didn't end. It just began again, the way all good ones do.